Hello, and welcome to Beyond Japan, an interdisciplinary podcast that looks at the broad reach of Japanese studies from within and beyond Japan. This podcast is brought to you by the Centre for Japanese Studies at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, in collaboration with the University of East Anglia. I'm your host, Oliver Moxham, Project Support Officer at the Centre for Japanese Studies and researcher of Japanese War Heritage. This week we are joined by Dr Chris Perkins, Senior Lecturer in Japanese at the University of Edinburgh, who will be discussing Japanese-Korean cultural exchange in the immediate post-war. We will be reflecting on how media shapes popular notions of both nations by their respective peoples after more than half a century of colonisation. We hope you enjoy the show. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So before we start, I'd like to ask a little bit more about you. Can you tell us about your field and how your interests brought you there?
Right. So I think, like lots of people in Japanese studies, I've been around the houses a little bit. So I started off doing Japanese anthropology and education studies, and spent a bit of time living in Japan and teaching English. Then I came back to the UK, and I did a master's degree in international relations. And at that point, I thought, this is what I wanted to do. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to continue with Japanese studies. I was quite interested in lots of other things at that time. So I did that, and then ended up doing a PhD in politics down at Royal Holloway in London. But for my PhD in politics, my supervisor was really keen for me to make use of the language skills that I've developed. So I ended up doing a PhD thesis looking at popular representations of Japanese nationalism, which was really, really interesting. And it enabled me to kind of connect together lots of different interests. So I was interested in representation of foreigners in Japan. I was interested in social theory quite a lot. And I was also sort of interested in trying to explain my own experiences in Japan. So I kind of wrote this thesis, and that was great. And I thought, I'd go into international relations or a politics department. And luckily for me, the job at Edinburgh came up, and I applied, and I was very lucky, and I was accepted for the position. But I found myself in a Japanese studies department, and the Japanese studies department was a bit different to my experience in a politics department beforehand. So lots of my interests, which were quite sort of, I suppose, theoretically driven, didn't feel as relevant to the culture of the department that I was in. So I kind of panicked a bit and scrabbled around, and I refocused my interests mostly on memory, cinema, and conflict in Japan. I've written about, I think that's probably one of the things that kind of runs through all of my work, is that I'm quite interested in the way in which stories are produced about Japan and how they're consumed and how they go on to shape and impact perspectives on the past. And so I've written a bit about anime. I've written a little bit about television, but I got very interested in the radical student movement in Japan in the 1960s. Now I write about it from the 1920s on to the 1970s. But for me, I was always really interested in this notion that Japan is apolitical. And then when I read all this stuff about sort of the radicalism of Japan in the post-war period and the pre-war period as well, I thought, okay, how do I square this story that I've been told about Japan and the history that I'm looking at? And the way I approached that was to try and find out how the stories about the radical period in Japan in the 60s have been shaped by the media, but also by kind of cultural interventions like cinema, and also television, novels, all that kind of thing. So that was what my first book was about. I was sort of I looked at a very particular New Left organization called the United Red Army, and I looked at how they, for want of a better word, spectacularly imploded in the early 1970s. And I looked at the way in which that story came to dominate, the story of their implosion came to dominate the narrative of the New Left in Japan more generally, and then how people in films used films to interrogate and challenge that narrative later on in the 90s and in the 2000s. So I guess the question then is, where do we get to Japanese Korean pop culture? And the answer to that is, when I was looking at the 1960s and looking at all this kind of radical format that's going on, one of the directors that kept on coming up, of course, was Oshima Nagisa, who I guess was the sort of representative filmmaker at the time. And I stumbled across a really odd documentary he made about a diary, and it was the Diary of Yunbogi. And I watched the documentary and I thought, well, this is really strange. I'm going to file that away and I'll come back to it later. And that's what I did. And then I was lucky enough to be invited to a conference on Japan-Korea relations and pop culture in Auckland. And I thought, okay, what can I write about? And this documentary came up again. So that's what I did. And when I started digging into the history of this documentary, it turned into a really, really interesting story about Japan-South Korea relations in the wake of normalization of relations in 1965. And I had all these really sort of interesting dynamics that I'd never thought about or never investigated. And that's then turned into a chapter in the book edited by Rumi Sakamoto and Stephen Epstein on popular culture and the transformation of Japan-Korea relations. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, that's my story and how we get to this point where I've written this book chapter. And it's probably worth noting that I'm a bit of an academic magpie. So although I do have a particular focus on Japanese radical student politics, I can write about anything that really interests me. And I've just found this incredibly interesting.
It's fascinating. You clearly have a very wide portfolio of research experience. So when it comes to relations between Japan and Korea, they're often given a negative light in the media through the context of Japan's historical occupation of the peninsula. Do you believe the hostile rhetoric heard from politicians on both sides reflects the sentiment of the people? And if so, how does cultural exchange occur in this context?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a cracking question, and I've thought about this a lot. And I reckon, the sort of the glib answer is that it's really complicated. But I think, so when I was thinking about how to sort of answer this question, one of the parts of it is, okay, so how does cultural exchange occur in a context of animosity? And I reckon one of the answers to that is that events happen, stuff happens. And because stuff happens, publics get interested in investigating sort of where that, the origin of that event. So in the example of the diary that I wrote about, I mean, this diary, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but this is a diary written by a street urchin that goes into 11 editions in 1965 in Japan once it's published. And the question is why? This is very, very strange. And the answer is, well, 1965 was normalization of relations between Japan and South Korea. And the Japanese public were really, really interested in South Korea all of a sudden. There was a dearth of media to consume, and this diary comes along, and everybody goes, right, I'm going to read that, and that will tell us about this new nation that we've started to construct a relationship with. And I think when you sort of move into sort of more contemporary times, we have a series of events, the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the 1998 decision of South Korea to allow Japanese cultural goods to be imported. Before that, it was illegal. The 2002 FIFA World Cup, which is jointly hosted by Japan and South Korea. So all of these things are happening, and every time something like this happens, people go, okay, well, I want to get to know this new group of people, this new nation that we're building a relationship with. How can I do that? Well, I do that through consuming popular culture, because that's what's at hand. And then sort of taking that a little bit further, I was thinking about this question in terms of, is it the hostile rhetoric of the politicians reflecting the sentiment of the people, or are they stirring things up? And I think that again, you need to push it a little bit further and make the question a little bit more, I don't know, nuanced, I suppose. So one way we could look at this process and say, well, media circulation between South Korea and Japan is a good thing. It brings people closer together. It helps them imagine each other better. It breaks down barriers. It helps people overcome history, constructs dialogue, all those lovely things. And I think, this is a sort of rosy glow version of globalization. And I reckon that there's a lot of truth to that. And there'll be lots of evidence that the circulation of this media is helping to break down barriers and is bringing publics together. And sort of on the flip side, then you can say, all right, so what are these politicians up to? Well, the cynic would say they're just stirring up things, and they're doing it for political reasons. They want to get re-elected, so they point to the baddie, and they say, elect me, and I'll keep you safe from that baddie. And of course, the historical tensions between Japan and South Korea make this easy. But again, I think that's a bit too simplistic, in that I reckon we need to deconstruct these binary oppositions between the people and the government. And in particular, just look at if we look at the people, I think we need to disaggregate that idea and think more about different publics that are constituted in different ways, and they have different values. And sort of from my reading, and again, I sort of have to stress that I'm not an expert on this. This is something that I'm very interested in, and I've come to through my research on the sort of the history of 1965. But I'm not an expert. But the research that I've been looking at seems to suggest that we can't just think about Japan and South Korea. We have to disaggregate these publics. And I think a really nice example of this is Stephen Epstein's discussion of K-pop idols and the Japanese flag in the book that my chapter appears in. So Epstein is one of the editors of that book. And the chapter is really interesting because it talks about how you have Korean pop idols that are incredibly popular in Japan. And they're doing the work of being international commodities and ambassadors and almost patriots for the Korean nation, going over to Japan and spreading the culture. But these pop idols can be very, very quickly and easily chastened for acting inappropriately. And one of the things that Epstein focuses on is pop idols in association with the rising sun Japanese flag. And he lists lots and lots of examples of how sort of unwitting pop idols have been caught with iconography in the shape of the rising sun Japanese flag, which is associated with Japanese war memories, and absolutely got pilloried in the media for it. And when we actually look at this media, yes, the mainstream media will be involved, but it's primarily netizens in South Korea who are watching and monitoring and policing the activities of South Korean pop idols when they are over in Japan, or sort of looking at the way in which they're constructing their identities as representatives of South Korea.
It seems quite surprising that that these K-pop idols could have such a lapse in judgment, to be wearing the rising sun on their clothing and in their merchandise. I was talking with Dr. Giulio Pugliese last week about Japan's relations with their neighbors, and he told me how Koreans have animosity towards Japan ingrained in their cultural identity when they were rebuilding their nation following half a century of colonization. So to what extent is this fresh in the minds of young Koreans? Do they associate Japan with the empire, or is it totally separate from that now? Do they think of Japan more in terms of its popular culture than they do of its historical atrocities?
Well, again, I think that you have to be careful not to sort of lump everybody together here, because you'll have groups of young South Koreans who will have constructed their identities around, preserving the purity of Korea and preserving the sort of what they see as the integrity of this narrative of victimization at the hands of the Japanese, so that whenever they see something that transgresses this narrative, they're going to be incredibly vocal in sort of chastising the person who they think has done the transgressing. But I think also there are going to be people out there who are just having fun, and they're going to be sort of getting themselves in situations where there might be a Japanese flag in the background. Or, one of the examples that Epstein points to is somebody who's wearing a t-shirt that just happens to look a little bit like a Japanese rising flag, but it actually wasn't. And because they were, not completely on their guards, and they happen to wear something which could be mistaken for this, they find themselves, being subject to all of this criticism online. So I reckon it would be, I completely get the argument that anti-Japanese sentiment is to an extent ingrained in culture, but that also suggests a model of culture which you can't change. So once it's there, it's done, right? And it also suggests a model of culture which is monolithic, and I'm not sure that's right. I reckon culture is always a process of negotiation, and it's also always a process of policing. And I reckon these kind of examples are examples of where we might see the people going out and being associated with these images and probably not really caring that much, not thinking it's a big deal, maybe because they didn't notice, or because it's not a Japanese flag, or because they're looking at it and seeing not Japanese colonial war memory, but they're seeing it associated with, I don't know, Yankee bikers in the 1970s.
My research specialty in culture tends to be in heritage, which is much more a top-down kind of culture, and much more dominance when you're actually exploring the country. In my time in Seoul, I was struck by the very visible anti-Japanese sentiment in much of the architecture. You would have models of the Dokdo Islands in the central Seoul tube station stating that it's not Japanese territory, it's Korean territory. I would go to Korean barbecue restaurants, and written on my little napkin would be Dokdo is Korean territory. It would be everywhere. I was surprised by how it was just so present on so many levels, which doesn't seem to be the case in Japanese culture. At least there isn't much anti-Korean rhetoric on their disposable napkins.
I think if you want to go and look for anti-Korean rhetoric in Japan, you can find it pretty quickly. But maybe it does manifest in very, very different ways. And I think that I think you're right. Of course, you're right that these territorial disputes and in particular the comfort women issues are incredibly important constituted part of South Korean national identity. There's no doubt about that. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is that yes, it's omnipresent, but it's not determinative, right? And I think that although you can have all of these, they feel a little bit like sort of Michael Billig's idea of banal nationalism. It's just kind of floating around all the time, and it's these little flaggings that are reinforcing a particular sort of understanding of identity vis-a-vis Japan. But people tend to transgress these sorts of injunctions all the time, whether by accident or because they don't care, or because they want to do it on purpose and to be subversive. And I think what I found quite interesting about sort of Epstein's discussion is that it made me think about the way in which sort of different constituted publics, so a public like netizens who are particularly sort of wedded to these ideas of protecting sort of Korean national integrity, can have a voice which is so amplified and so powerful that it can lead to these sort of very public apologies from idols once they get, once their transgressions are outed. And there might be very minor transgressions. Someone's found one picture on Instagram, and that becomes like the biggest deal in the world. But I think when I was thinking about this also, I was sort of thinking about like the tension between, you have these cultural flows going between Japan and Korea. And again, you might think that these cultural flows are going to be sort of erasing the border just by the friction of the flow itself. But these performances of contrition by the the idols when they get outed by particular consuming publics. It seems like that performance itself is again reinforcing the boundary. So there's like this weird sort of double mechanism going on. I don't want to come across as dismissing, the power of these narratives in Korea, but I do think that it's important to realize that I don't think you can aggregate everybody all the time. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say.
So to move on to your recent chapter, you recently published a chapter looking at post-war relations between Japan and Korea through a book titled The Diary of Yoonbulgi. Could you explain the book a bit here and describe the impacts you believe it had?
Yeah, sure. So the book itself, it was actually written in 1964 by a poor South Korean young boy, Lee Young-bok, who was living in just on the outskirts of Daegu. And this kid was living in pretty desperate conditions. So his mother had left, and we don't really know why. His father was an alcoholic and very ill, and he had two siblings, a younger sister and a younger brother. And he was going into school and doing his best, but he was also selling gum on the streets of the city in which he lived. And so the story goes that he was, showing some aptitude for writing. So his teacher said, "Why don't you keep a diary?" So he kept this diary. And it turned out the diary was seen by the teachers as a really interesting chronicle of this child's life, and sort of showed how he was, even though he was battling against all of these terrible circumstances, he was managing to do something with his life. And in the end, the diary was serialized in a Korean newspaper. And it was made into a film as well in South Korea, and that film went on to win the Blue Dragon Award in '65, which is quite the accolade. And as a sort of interesting aside, the film then seemed to have disappeared until it turned up again in a Taiwanese archive with the sort of Chinese subtitles burnt into it. So that's the only version you can get hold of at the moment. Anyway, so that film was made, and that's all very well and good. But then sort of 1965 comes along, and you have normalization of relations between South Korea and Japan. And, like I said at the beginning, this event provoked massive interest in all things South Korea. And before then, there hadn't been much interest in Korea at all. And if there had been interest, it was usually, again, sort of animosity. So this book is sitting in South Korea, and you have sort of a constellation of factors that come together to get the book published in Japan. One of the factors is you have the publisher, who himself, I think, who is Zainichi Korean, and he was really interested in getting this book over to Japan and translated so that the Japanese people could come to know his homeland a bit better. But there's also the guy, the translator, and Tsukamoto, he was in Osaka, and he was working with Koreans there, and he was very, very interested in the Korean languages, putting together a dictionary. And he found out about this book, and he was asked to translate it, and he didn't really know very much. He was working on his Korean, but he wasn't very good. So he got the book and he translated it. He was working with people he knew in South Korea. And when it was finally published, it was absolutely eaten up by the Japanese public. And as I said at the beginning, it went into about 11 editions in the first year, and it was the best-selling book of the year. And so one of the reasons that it was really successful is there was already a template for it. So about 10 years beforehand, a diary had been written by a Zainichi Korean girl living in Japan, and that had gone off, and that had been incredibly popular, and that had been made into a film as well. So there was already a template for this type of publication. But also, of course, it was actually the first South Korean book to be translated and published in Japan. So that was also an accolade that made people want to buy it. But I didn't know very much about the book itself until I'd done a bit of research into it to try and understand the documentary film that I was looking at. The documentary is such an odd thing, and it's available on YouTube. So if you go off onto YouTube and Google The Diary of Yoonbulgi Oshima Nagisa, you can watch it in full if you so want to. It's only about 20 minutes long, and it's so odd. It's effectively a load of still photographs that have been put together by Oshima, with a narration. So in I think it was 1964, he'd been over in South Korea and he'd been traveling around taking photographs, and he was trying to get to know sort of the real Korea. And if you watch his films, he has this obsession with Korea and the colonial legacy of Japan. So he was taking all these photographs and he brought them back, and then normalization happens and he goes, crikey, I need to make a documentary about this. What have I got in terms of resources to do so? And he looks at these photographs and goes, okay, I've got these photographs and we've got this diary. So what can we do? And he kind of smushes them together. And he makes this, what almost looks like a PowerPoint presentation using black and white photographs with a voiceover. And whereas the diary is sort of a story of a boy struggling against adversity to sort of realize himself, and it's quite a positive message in there. Oshima's version of the diary is almost solely focused on the poverty of the living conditions of the children that he found when he was in South Korea. So he's got just reams of photographs of children. And then the kind of classic photographs of almost like what you'd associate with sort of more contemporary photographs of areas of poverty. So lots of sort of naked children covered in dirt, distended bellies, that kind of thing. And what the documentary does is it changes the story of the diary into a story of just pure sort of abject poverty and the need to rise up against that poverty. And the narration for the documentary is very, very interesting because obviously the diary is the voice of the child, so the child has agency. But the documentary is the voice of an unidentified Japanese narrator who is listening to Yunbogi's story, but also narrating that story back to the child and creating a story around the child. And when you look at where that story seems to go, it says, okay, so, you know, you live in poverty, your life is very, very difficult. What can you do? And the answer seems to be from the narrator, well, you have to rise up, you have to fight, you have to hold the authorities to task. And as the narrative proceeds, we see more and more pictures of student radicalism in South Korea, and pictures of this child seemingly watching and learning and thinking and developing a political consciousness. And when I was watching this, I was thinking, okay, so this is really interesting because this film has come out in the wake of AMPO in 1960, which was sort of mass protest against the passing of a security treaty between Japan and the United States of America, or the revision of that security treaty. And it was incredibly divisive. And it was seen as this incredible moment of grassroots politics in Japan. And it seemed to have passed by 1965. And the radical politics, although it was simmering and beneath the surface and would come out again in the late 1960s, in 64, 65, it was kind of feeling that, have we had our moment? And what the documentary seems to be doing is saying to the Japanese public, look at South Korea, look at what these guys are suffering, look at their history of radicalism. Let's form a community with these people. Let's form a new imagined community between us, who have also been oppressed by a government, us who have also been misled by a government, us who remember what it was like at the end of the war. And look at these images, don't they look just like what Japan looked like at the end of the war? And let's regain our radical political consciousness and start fighting again.
I was going to ask that Japan itself had experienced a lot of poverty in the immediate post-war. There's famous pictures of Osaka, which was totally burned down in the war, people living in shacks. And that must have been a point of relatability for Japanese reading that book, I imagine.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And I think there's some really, really interesting things about that, because one, again, we can go back to what are these cultural flows doing? And in one sense, they are absolutely bringing people together, because you're now seeing, in Japan, you're now seeing the Korean people, you're now reading Korean voices. But I think one of the constitutive elements of the relationship between Japan and Korea as a sort of legacy of colonialism is always this weird temporal lagging between Korea and Japan. So where, Japan was the first to modernized, industrialized in the face of Western imperialism. Japan's whole story about, well, the story it told itself and the story it told its colonies about the war period was only Japan can safeguard Asia. Only Japan is a repository for everything that's good about East Asia, but it's also taken all the best of the West, so Japan can fight on our behalf. Of course, this was incredibly problematic for a million different reasons, but it was always the case that even in the pre-war periods, whereas Korea was part of the Japanese Empire, Korea was also sort of temporarily set behind the Japanese Empire in terms of civilization, and Koreans had to catch up. And I think what you see, interestingly, in this diary is, or the film of this diary, is the same sort of narrative coming out. It's like, look at South Korea now. South Korea now, and this is sort of 1965, looks like Japan at the end of the war. Remember how awful that was, guys. Remember how that made everybody feel, and animated people. And remember how angry it made us at our government. Rekindle that feeling. So it's sort of a way of trying to access, for Oshima Nagisa, to kind of get the Japanese people to access a set of emotions that might have been dulled in the 1960s because of the income doubling scheme, and everybody's wages are going up, and TVs and all that lovely stuff are happening. But it's a kind of, there's also like, when you look at the commentaries around the diary, because the diary is on the top 100 books that you must read list put together by the National Diet Library. And if you look at some of the discussions around newer editions of the diary now, a lot of them are kind of, kids today need to read this diary so that they can reclaim what was lost to Japan through economic development in the 1960s through to now. So Korea becomes this repository for all these values that Japan seems to have lost because it marched too far ahead with its sort of westernizing, industrializing mission. And actually, in a kind of really perverse way, aren't the Koreans really lucky that their progress was retarded because of our colonial interventions?
That's awful.
And it's a really, really complicated and problematic set of statements that are embedded in this story. And they just keep on coming back over and over again.
Yeah, it seems very interesting that the memory of poverty becomes a common point that can replace the memory of war or colonialism.
You're absolutely right, because I think, and it's strategic, right? I think what Oshima Nagisa is trying to do is he's trying to assemble a new public through this piece of media. And he has to find new points of reference, new ways of constructing identities, and these identities then they become sort of linked to like where is the shared experience here, or maybe the shared experience is that we were both oppressed and misled by government, and that idea then sort of is attempting to negate the very, very difficult hierarchical relationship between Japan and Korea from the war, before the war, during the war, and that goes on to the present day.
One of the most controversial legacies of the war is the Zainichi Koreans, that is to say, Japanese nationals descended from Koreans who emigrated, some voluntarily, some forcibly, to Japan during its imperial days, who often found themselves caught between the two cultural identities of Korea and Japan. There have been many cultural productions by Zainichi Koreans addressing this, such as Min Jin Lee's book Pachinko, Yong Hee Yang's film Sona, The Other Myself, and Yan Yun Ho's action film Fighter in the Winds, to name a few. How do Zainichi productions fit in with Japanese and Korean cultural exchange?
It's a cracking question. It's a really hard one to answer well, at least for me. I can give it a shot though, and I think that, again, when I was thinking about this, my first response is they're incredibly important in providing narratives and giving voice and adding texture and visibility to Zainichi Koreans. And that's just a statement. I think that's just a statement of fact. But it made me kind of reflect a little bit on my own experience of consuming this kind of media. And I don't know if you've seen or heard of the film Go.
I'm not sure if I have.
Yeah, so this, I suppose I'm now getting old, right? So most of my sort of media reference points are sort of in the 2000s, but Go was film directed by Ikisa Sao in 2001. And it was based on a novel by Kaneshiro Kazuki, who himself was Zainichi Korean. And back in 2001, where was I? I was doing I've done a Japanese degree. I was doing a Japanese degree. I didn't know very much about what was going on. I watched this movie, and it's about a high school boy who is Zainichi himself, and he goes to a school that's associated with the North Korean Association for Zainichi Koreans. And it's about his life and how he kind of leaves that school and he goes into a mainstream school and falls in love with a Japanese girl. And it was amazing. I absolutely loved it. It's a fantastic film. So anybody who is interested in sort of this kind of topic, but also just likes a good movie, should go and watch it. And when I watched it, I was like, wow, this is incredible. I never knew about all of these really complex and difficult identity politics in Japan. I think there was an element of, well, Japan's wondrous in it, kind of thinking with me back then, because I was just starting my my journey into Japanese studies. So I watched this, and one of the things about the film is you've got this very individualistic, very cool Zainichi Korean who's trying to pass as well as at some point with his Japanese name. But the narrative is very much about him denouncing all of the different politics that you find surrounding Zainichi identity in Japan. He denounces the North Korean associations, the South Korean associations. He hates the idea of being labelled as Zainichi, and the whole sort of narrative is just treat me as me. I'm an individual. I have my own narrative, and I'm in control of that. And it's sort of through that, asserting that he, overcomes difficulties with this girl that he meets, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I was thinking about that, and then I ended up reading an article by a guy called Kuraishi Ichiro. It's in a really good book edited by Son Ryan and John Liu about Zainichi Korean cultural production. And he's got quite an interesting take on this film, because he says, right, it's fantastic in the sense that it's producing these narratives, but at the same time, it's asserting this individualist approach, it kind of rejects any form of collective identity whatsoever as the way of solving sort of the identity problems of Zainichi Koreans in Japan. And in a sense, that also is very problematic, because questions of history and connectivity and identity seem to get pushed to one side, and it comes almost like it's like neoliberal project of saying, well, just be you, everything will be fine. So I think that sort of reflecting on that film and these arguments, I think that these Zainichi productions are absolutely important. But we need to go back to, again, how are they being read? How are they being consumed? What kind of conversations they're provoking? And again, that's sort of what I'm quite interested in, is that we have these narratives in front of you, but the narratives that we read or we watch, they don't determine the way in which they're used later. And I think sort of the challenge now for a lot of scholarship is actually to go off and trace this stuff, find out how it's talked about, and sort of whether or not we are seeing whether or not we're seeing change based on these productions. So, I'm unfortunate I'm not able to sort of address those individual films themselves, but they're kind of my thoughts on that, about what we need to do to understand it better, at least.
Looking back at more historical media representations, as a colony, Koreans were portrayed in a derogatory, racist caricature by imperial Japanese media. Through this post-war exchange of culture, was this image of Koreans rehabilitated in the post-war period?
Sort of, yeah. I think it's very difficult. I mean, yes, absolutely. I don't think you go to, you'd be walking around Tokyo and asking people about what they think of South Korea, and they'd pull out some sort of propaganda from the 1930s or 40s. But sort of looking at it historically, after the war, a lot of we had all these sort of black markets popping up, and very quickly the story was that these black markets that were popping up were being controlled by Korean gangs that were funneling money away from the Japanese and exploiting. There was lots and lots of narratives emanating from all over the place in the post-war period up till sort of about the, I guess, sort of mid-1950s, which were these Korean organizations in Korean resident Japan will destabilize Japan, and we need to get rid of them. I think when we moved into sort of the 1960s, there was a sense of almost apathy in the general public, and then of course you have these kind of little booms where people are very, very interested in sort of Korean things. So the boom around 1965 normalization, and later on sort of the booms around sort of the Olympics and things like that. And I think, yeah, I mean, of course the stereotypes have been dispelled to a certain extent, but there are still like all these lingering ideas about again, this kind of temporal relationship between Korea and Japan. And I think that's something that is definitely continuing, is this idea that Japan leads and South Korea follows. That hasn't gone away. And so I think that's sort of one of the that's quite interestingly linked to one of the other things, some of the questions that you sent me, which is about the sort of the challenge to Japanese pop culture dominance in East Asia and globally from sort of new South Korean pop culture. Also fits into this narrative of, well, we Japanese did that first, and now the South Koreans have basically taken our template and they're having a go with it, and that's great, but we've moved on to better or other things. Or, the narrative in Japan is, and now what are we going to do? And it kind of fits into this victimization narrative. Oh, poor Japan. Poor Japan's getting beaten by everybody in the world, and South Korea has stolen all of our ideas and doing them better, poor Japan. So I think, whereas maybe absolutely the very, unless you're kind of hanging around on 4chans or 2chan, sorry, the really vociferous, very horrible images of South Korea have fallen away to a certain extent in Japan. I think a lot of the sort of lingering sense of superiority is absolutely still there. And the sense that sort of a mixture of superiority and woe is us, that they're just copying us and beating us at our own game, and that's not particularly even that's not particularly something that is just about Japan. You can think of some of the narrative coming out of the States at the moment about Chinese are copying us and beating us at our own game, woe is us. I think this is sort of part of the course, but there is that dynamic between Japan and South Korea, I think, that's lingered on.
That leads on to the last question I want to ask for this episode. Is there anything that other imperial nations can learn from Japanese-Korean cultural exchange in reconciling their relations and their notions of formerly colonized countries? Bit of a wild card there, but...
Yeah, it's a tricky one, eh? I mean, I suppose that my response to that is, has Japan-Korea popular relations reconciled these two nations? And I reckon the answer is maybe not so much, or at least if that has happened, it's happened in complex ways. Crikey. I mean, I'm not sure I have a useful answer to this question, other than I think what we need to do is we need to keep on sort of tracing the impacts of these different popular culture products and look at them in their complexity, and think about the ways in which they might be bringing together and distancing at the same time. And I think it's only when we sort of sit and ask really hard questions about that. I think people like Yoguchi Koichi, started this program research back in the 2000s. I think that's something we still need to do. I think maybe one thing that everybody can learn from Japan is that once a national government says something's cool, it's not cool anymore. And I think that was one of the problems with the Cool Japan initiative, is that you had this wonderful popular culture coming out of Japan that's going around the world and it was doing really, really interesting things. And then a load of sort of grey bureaucrats came along and said, yeah, this is great. Aren't we really cool? And started talking about it. And then everybody went, nah, it's not cool anymore. And that's when it started looking at South Korean popular culture, because it had that sense of dynamism and effervescence that the Japanese one had sucked away by its government. But I think one of the other things to note with this is that if we look at the Japanese case, these booms end, and the question is, what's left? What are the long-lasting connections that have been constructed after the booms happened? And if we're going to learn something about it, it's maybe the boom itself is great, and it's wonderful for the companies that are involved and for the sort of projection of a particular national image. But unless there's a lot of work going on underneath to make sure that sort of the connections that are created through that boom are institutionalized and live on a bit longer, they might just be a flash in the pan. So I guess that's my 2 cents on that.
Well, it's been an insightful episode. Thank you for all your answers, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you very much for the great questions.
You can find Chris's research profile in the description below. You can read more about his research in his 2020 chapter, The Diary of Yunbogi and Japan-Korea Relations. Join us next week when we will be in discussion with Dr. Lola Martinez on Akira Kurosawa versus Western cinema. Thank you for listening.